Have you ever stopped to really notice someone no one else is seeing? Late afternoon Chicago, a regular neighborhood grocery store, cold lights, tidy aisles, the repetitive beep of the register setting the rhythm of modern life. People rush by, staring at their phones, lost in their own worlds. And it's right there, in that completely ordinary place, that something extraordinary is about to happen. Daniel Harris is 47 years old, wearing a $3,000 suit and carrying a hollowness in his chest that no professional success has ever managed to fill. He isn't there to shop. He's there because his luxury apartment has turned into a silent prison. And silence, sometimes, screams too loud. In the checkout line, he notices an elderly woman, worn coat, shaky hands, a tired but dignified look. The total is announced. She opens her old wallet, counts the wrinkled bills, and starts handing items back one by one. First the cheese, then the coffee, finally the bread. Each item placed back on the belt is a small piece of dignity being bargained away. Around them, people look away. After all, other people's embarrassment is uncomfortable, right? Better to pretend it's not happening. But Daniel doesn't look away, because in that banal moment, in that silent gesture of a stranger, he sees something that freezes him, the image of his own mother, the woman he loved, neglected, and lost without ever getting the chance to tell her how much she mattered. And then he makes a decision that will change not only that elderly woman's fate, but his own as well. Because sometimes true wealth begins when we finally choose to really see someone. And you? When was the last time you truly stopped to see someone? It was late afternoon in Chicago, and the sky seemed undecided between gray and pale gold. The cold autumn wind pushed dry leaves across the parking lot of a neighborhood grocery store on the city's west side. The metallic screech of shopping carts blended with distant car horns and the constant hum of the metropolis, that pulse that never stops, even when everything inside you already has. Daniel Harris parked his black sedan in a random spot, far from the entrance. He wasn't in a hurry. In fact, he had no real reason to be there at all. 47 years old, executive at a major investment firm, impeccable Italian suit, understated Swiss watch. Daniel was the kind of man people noticed without quite knowing why. Maybe it was his straight posture. Maybe it was the controlled, almost empty expression. He pushed a small cart through the aisles lit by harsh white lights. The grocery store was ordinary, clean, functional, nothing that matched the life he lived, but that was exactly why he was there. Over the past few months, Daniel had developed the habit of frequenting places like this, neighborhood markets, small cafes, park benches, as if he were searching for something he couldn't quite name. His apartment, a modern downtown loft overlooking the river, had become unbearable. The silence echoed violently. Every room seemed to demand something from him. Every polished surface reflected a version of himself he no longer recognized. 2 years earlier, his mother had died, Margaret Harris, 72 years old, always smiling, always patient, always waiting for him to show up. She lived alone in Evanston, just 40 minutes away. Daniel promised he'd visit every weekend, promised to take her out to dinner, promised he'd spend more time once the next project wrapped up, once the next important meeting was over. But things never slowed down. Then, on a Tuesday morning, he got the call. Massive stroke. By the time he reached the hospital, it was already too late. Margaret lay there with her eyes closed, as if she had simply fallen asleep waiting for him. Once again, Daniel stood beside the bed for hours. He didn't cry. He couldn't. He just held her hand, feeling the weight of every broken promise. And what destroyed him most wasn't the pain of losing her. It was knowing that moment would come, and that he had chosen to ignore it until it was too late. Since then, something inside him had cracked. He kept working, closing deals, running meetings, but it felt like watching his own life from the outside, through fogged glass. Everything sounded distant, unreal, weightless. Daniel stopped at the bread section, grabbed a random package and put it in the cart, not because he needed it, just to justify being there. He headed toward the checkout, still lost in thoughts that led nowhere. The line was moderately long. He stood behind an elderly woman holding a small basket with both hands. She wore a beige coat frayed at the edges, with a wool scarf wrapped around her neck, white hair pulled into a simple bun. Wrinkled, trembling hands, yet steady as they gripped the basket handle. Daniel didn't pay much attention at first, until the cashier, A young guy, bored, earbuds hanging around his neck, announced the total, $23.65. The woman hesitated. She opened her old brown leather purse, pulled out a few crumpled bills, and started counting. Her lips moved silently, as if each number were a prayer. Then she stopped, looked at the groceries, looked at the money in her shaking hands, and slowly began handing items back, one by one. The first item was the cheese. She held it for a moment, as if it weighed more than it should, then carefully placed it back on the conveyor belt with almost reverent care. Then came the coffee. Next, a small box of tea. Each movement was slow, deliberate, loaded with a quiet dignity that seemed to scream in that indifferent environment. "You can take this one off too," she said, pointing to the whole wheat bread. Her voice was low, but steady. There was no pleading in it, no shame, just the tired acceptance of someone who had fought this battle many times before. The cashier sighed, impatient, and began scanning the items back. Beep, beep, beep. Each sound echoed like a small abandonment. Behind her, people in line looked away. Others checked their phones. A middle-aged woman shook her head, annoyed by the delay. Daniel stood completely still. He watched the elderly woman's hands that trembled slightly, yet still handled each item with meticulous care, as if she were trying to preserve some sense of control over that private defeat. She wasn't crying. She wasn't complaining. She was simply organizing what remained. A gallon of milk, a carton of eggs, a single apple. And then something strange happened inside Daniel. A physical sensation, almost violent, tore through his chest. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. He knew that silence, that desperate attempt to hold it together while everything collapses inside. It was the same silence he'd felt in the hospital, standing beside his mother, when he realized he had arrived too late to say what mattered, too late to be present. The woman paid for what remained, $16.40. She placed the groceries into a worn cloth bag and turned to leave. That's when her eyes met Daniel's for a fraction of a second. There was no judgment in her gaze, no request, just a deep exhaustion, the kind only someone who's carried the world alone for far too long can recognize. She headed toward the exit. Daniel stood frozen, cart still in his hands, while the cashier called out impatiently, "Sir, are you checking out or what?" He didn't answer. His mind was moving in slow motion, processing what he had just witnessed. He thought of his mother, of the times she casually mentioned she was cutting back, of the times she said everything was fine, even when it wasn't, of the small sacrifices he never noticed because he was too busy building a life that now felt completely empty. Margaret never asked for help. She just waited for him to notice, waited for him to show up. And he never did. But this time, Daniel left the cart right there and walked quickly toward the exit. The cold wind hit his face as the automatic doors slid open. He scanned the parking lot until he spotted her, the elderly woman walking slowly, holding the bag with both hands, heading toward a bus that had just stopped across the street. He picked up his pace. "Wait!" he called out, his voice louder than he intended. The woman turned, startled. The wind tousled the white strands escaping her bun. She watched him approach with a cautious, almost defensive expression, like someone who's learned to distrust sudden kindness. Daniel stopped a few steps away, out of breath, not quite knowing what to say. For a moment, they just stood there in the middle of that gray parking lot while the bus honked impatiently and the world kept spinning around them. And then he said the only thing that made sense. You left some things behind." The woman frowned, confused. "I did?" she repeated, looking into her bag as if trying to remember what she had bought. Daniel took a deep breath. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't thought of the right words. He only knew he couldn't let her walk away. Not this time. "Yeah, some things stayed at the register," he said, improvising. "I saw it when you left. If you want, I can go get them for you." She studied him closely. Her faded blue eyes seemed to look right through him, reading something beyond his words. There was a quiet intelligence there, forged by decades of hardship and disappointment. She knew exactly what he was doing. "A son," she said, gently but firmly. "I know what I left there, and I left it because I couldn't afford it." The honesty of those words cut through the air like a sharp blade. No drama, no self-pity, just the naked truth, spoken by someone who no longer had the energy for disguises. Daniel swallowed hard. "I know," he replied, his voice lower now. "But I'd like to pay." "If you'll let me." The silence that followed was long. The bus honked again, impatient. The driver waved angrily from the window. The woman looked back, then at Daniel, torn between need and pride. That pride that's the last thing you have when everything else is already gone. "Why would you do that?" she asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice, not suspicion. Daniel hesitated. How do you explain that this wasn't really about her, but about everything he never did, about all the times he ignored, postponed, pretended not to see? "Because," he began, and his voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "Because someone I loved used to do the same thing. Pretend everything was fine, and I never asked if it really was." The woman's expression softened. Something in her recognized his pain, maybe because she carried her own. The bus doors closed and it pulled away, leaving a cloud of gray exhaust behind. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. "Evelyn," she replied after a pause. "Evelyn Carter." "Yeah, Daniel Harris," he said, holding out his hand. Evelyn shook it with surprising firmness for someone so fragile. Her skin was rough, marked by time and work. "Shall we go back inside?" Daniel suggested with a small smile. Evelyn nodded slowly. They walked side by side back into the grocery store. Inside, Daniel grabbed a new cart and, without saying a word, began placing the items she had returned: the cheese, the coffee, the tea, the whole wheat bread. Then he added some fruit, a chicken, pasta, tomato sauce. Evelyn watched quietly, her eyes filling, but not with sadness, with something deeper, more complex. At the register, the same bored young cashier scanned everything without asking questions. Daniel paid $112, a ridiculous amount for him, a fortune for her. Outside, as they organized the bags in the back seat of Daniel's car, Evelyn finally spoke. "My son used to do the grocery shopping with me," she said, her voice trembling. "Every Friday. He'd pick me up, we'd come here, then have coffee at the bakery on the corner." Daniel froze, holding a bag in midair. "And now?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. Evelyn looked toward the horizon, where the sun was finally surrendering to night. "Now it's been 3 years since he's called me. He got married, moved to Seattle. I guess he was ashamed of his poor mother." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet, because in that moment he understood. He was that son. Daniel stood there, frozen, holding the bags, unable to move. Evelyn's words echoed in his mind like a funeral bell. 3 years. 3 years without a call. 3 years of silence, absence, abandonment disguised as a busy life. He knew that story well. He was its main character. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, discreetly wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to unload like this. You've already done so much." "No," Daniel interrupted, his voice hoarse. "You don't need to apologize." He placed the bags in the back seat and closed the door carefully. When he turned back to Evelyn, something in his face had changed. The polished executive mask had cracked, and through that opening spilled something far more human, far more vulnerable. Can I take you home?" he offered. Evelyn hesitated. The natural distrust of someone who'd lived too long on her own flickered for a moment. But then she looked into his eyes and saw something that made her nod. "I live nearby, 3 blocks from here." The drive was short, but every second felt heavy, stretched like an eternity. Daniel drove slowly, as if he wanted to prolong that moment, or maybe he was just afraid of what came next. Evelyn guided him with gentle gestures. Left here, right there. That red brick house at the end of the street. It was a small, modest home, with peeling paint on the windows and a garden that must have once been well cared for. Now there were only a few resilient plants, fighting against neglect. Daniel turned off the engine. Neither of them moved right away. "When my mother died," Daniel began, staring straight ahead. "I was in a meeting in New York. She called me the night before. I saw the call. I let it go to voicemail. I thought I'd call her back the next day." He gripped the steering wheel tightly. "But the next day, she was gone. And I never got to say it. Never got to say she mattered. That she was important." The silence that followed was deep, sacred. Evelyn didn't say anything. She simply placed her wrinkled hand over Daniel's, a simple gesture carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. "Your son still has time," Daniel said, finally turning to her. "But I didn't. And that eats me alive every single day." Evelyn squeezed his hand with a tenderness he hadn't felt in years. "You know what I've learned, Daniel," she said. her voice soft but steady. "We can't change what's already happened, but we can choose how we live whatever time we still have." Those words pierced him like a perfectly aimed arrow, striking something that had been asleep, numbed. Daniel felt his eyes burn. For the first time in 2 years, the tears came, and he didn't stop them. Evelyn waited patiently while he cried in silence. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a man finally allowing himself to feel what he had buried too deep. When he pulled himself together, he helped Evelyn carry the bags inside. The house was simple, clean, filled with old photographs on the walls. One caught Daniel's attention, Evelyn as a young woman, standing beside a smiling boy, the two of them hugging. "Is that him?" he asked. "It is," she replied with a sad smile. "Thomas? He was 12 in that picture." Daniel stared at the photo for a long moment, and then he made a decision. "Evelyn," he said, turning to her, "can I come back here? Not out of pity, not charity, but because I need to do this. For me." Evelyn studied him once more with those eyes that saw more than they should. Then she smiled. "You can, Daniel. You can come back any time you want." When he left that house and got back into his car, the weight in his chest had changed. It hadn't disappeared, but now it had a purpose. Daniel came back the following week, and the next one too. At first the visits were brief. He brought groceries, checked if Evelyn needed anything, talked for a few minutes at the door. Nothing elaborate, nothing forced, just presence, something he had forgotten how to offer. But it was on the third visit that everything changed. When Daniel arrived, Evelyn didn't answer the door right away. He rang the bell twice. Nothing. Knocked lightly. Silence. His heart started racing. Dark thoughts flooded his mind in an instant. What if she had fallen? What if she was sick? What if— "Evelyn!" he called, knocking harder. Finally, the door opened. She was pale, leaning against the wall, breathing with difficulty. "Sorry, dear," she said weakly. "I haven't been feeling so well these past few days." Daniel rushed inside, helped her to the couch. Her skin was cold. She coughed softly, holding her chest. "Have you seen a doctor?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "I can't really go," she replied, resigned. "The clinic is far, and I can't take the bus by myself anymore." Something inside Daniel ignited. It wasn't anger. It was determination. "We're going now," he said firmly. "Daniel, you don't have to— We're going," he repeated, gentler now. "Please." She didn't argue. At the ER, Daniel stayed by her side through the entire wait, 3 hours. He canceled 2 meetings by text, ignored urgent emails, turned off his phone. None of it mattered. For the first time in years, he was exactly where he needed to be. The diagnosis was bronchitis. Nothing serious, but it required care. Medication, rest, proper meals. Daniel wrote everything down, bought the prescriptions at the hospital pharmacy, took Evelyn back home and organized her kitchen, making hot tea while she rested on the couch. "You don't need to do this," Evelyn murmured, watching him with tired eyes. "I know," Daniel replied, sitting beside her. "But I want to." They were the same words he'd spoken at the grocery store, but now they carried a different weight. They were no longer about guilt. They were about choice. In the days that followed, Daniel reorganized his life. He started working from home 3 days a week, stopped by Evelyn's house every morning before work, brought fresh coffee, fruit, talked about trivial things, the weather, the news, the neighbors. Small moments that, added together, built something bigger. It was during one of those visits that Evelyn mentioned, almost offhandedly, "There's a woman down the street, Dorothy, who also lives alone. I think she's doing worse than I am." Daniel filed it away mentally. Then it was a war veteran 3 houses down. Then a single mother with 2 small kids. Daniel began to notice something that had always been there, but that he had never truly seen. An entire neighborhood of invisible people, fighting alone, in silence. He couldn't help everyone, but he could do something. Daniel looked up community services in the area. He found a local program that organized food deliveries for seniors, but it was out of funds. He made an anonymous donation, small but enough to keep the program running for 6 more months. He also began connecting people, introduced Dorothy to Evelyn, organized a community lunch in the small hall of the neighborhood church, not as an executive, not as some big-hearted benefactor, just as someone who finally learned how to stay, how to see, how to be present. And somewhere in the middle of all that, something extraordinary happened. The guilt he'd been carrying started to turn into something else. It didn't disappear, but it found purpose. It found direction. One night, as Daniel was leaving Evelyn's house, she called him back. "Daniel," she said, holding his hand, "thank you for everything, but most of all, for staying." He squeezed her hand back, unable to speak, because he knew she wasn't thanking him only for herself. She was thanking him for his mother, too. 6 months later. Spring. The same parking lot where everything began looked completely different now. The trees that had been gray skeletons were bursting with white and pink blossoms. The air carried that unmistakable scent of a fresh start. Wet soil, cut grass, life stubbornly pushing its way back out. Daniel parked and walked toward the grocery store entrance. But this time, he wasn't alone. Evelyn walked beside him, her step still slow but steady. She wore a new coat, his birthday gift to her, and carried a cloth tote printed with flowers. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked with a mischievous smile. "Absolutely," Daniel said. They went in together, moved calmly through the aisles, picking out ingredients for the community lunch that now happened every other Monday in the church hall. Dorothy would be there, the veteran too, the single mom and her kids. More than 20 people total, a small community Daniel helped rebuild, not with money, but with presence. At the register, Daniel recognized the same bored young cashier from months earlier, but now the kid smiled when he saw them. "Hey, Mr. Daniel, Ms. Evelyn," he said, genuinely upbeat. "What's up, Marcus?" Daniel replied. He'd learned his name. He'd learned a lot of names. As Marcus scanned the items, Evelyn looked at Daniel with that expression he knew so well, half serious, half amused, filled with quiet wisdom. "You know what I noticed?" she said. "You don't come in here anymore with that face like you're running from something." Daniel smiled. It was true. The minimalist apartment was still there, with its polished surfaces and its deafening silence, but he wasn't running anymore. Because he'd learned you don't fill silence by escaping it. You fill it by actually living. "That's because I'm not running anymore," he said. Outside, they sat on a bench near the entrance. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement. Evelyn opened her bag, pulled out an apple, split it in half, and offered one half to Daniel. "Thank you," he said, taking it. "For what?" she teased. "It's just an apple." "No, thank you for letting me stay." Evelyn chewed slowly, thoughtful. "You know I called Thomas, right?" she said suddenly. Daniel turned, surprised. "You did?" "I did? Last week?" She paused. "We talked, for real, for the first time in years. And, how did it go?" "Hard," she admitted, "but necessary." He cried. I cried. We've still got a long road, but he said he's coming to visit next month. Daniel felt his chest tighten, but not from pain, from something that felt a lot like hope. "I'm happy for you, Evelyn. Really happy." "And you know why I had the courage to call?" she asked, turning to him. "Why?" "Because of you. Because you showed me it's still worth trying, that it's still worth believing people can change." Daniel couldn't answer. He just took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. They sat there in silence, watching the parking lot move, carts squeaking, families coming and going, kids laughing, life happening in all its ordinary, extraordinary simplicity. And Daniel finally understood what his mother would have said if she could talk to him one more time. It isn't about paying back the past. It's about honoring the love that still exists by offering presence, choosing to stay, deciding to truly see someone. "You know what?" Daniel said, breaking the silence. "What?" "I think my mom would have liked you." Evelyn smiled, a full, genuine smile that lit up her tired face. "I'm sure I would have liked her too." The wind blew softly, carrying flower petals that danced in the air, and for the first time in 2 years, Daniel Harris felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. If you made it this far, maybe this story touched something in you, and if it did, it wasn't by accident, because deep down, we've all been Daniel at some point, too busy, too distracted, putting off what actually matters, promising we'll call tomorrow, that we'll visit next weekend, that we'll be present soon, soon, until one day, suddenly, there's no time left. But we've also been Evelyn, right? Invisible, fighting alone, waiting for someone to notice, to see us, to simply stay. And maybe the biggest lesson here is this. Real life, the kind that's worth it, doesn't happen in huge dramatic gestures or flashy victories. It happens in the small moments, in the grocery store line, on a park bench, in the call you finally make, in the presence you choose to offer when it would be so much easier to just keep walking. So if this story hit you, pause for a second, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, who in my life is waiting for me to show up? Who needs to know they matter? Who have I been making invisible? And then, do something about it. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be big. It can be just a call, a visit, a real honest presence. Because in the end, it's not material wealth that defines who we are. It's the trail of humanity we leave behind. It's choosing to see someone when everyone else looks away. It's having the courage to stay when it would be more convenient to leave. If you like this story and want more narratives like this, full of humanity, truth, and hope, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because here, we believe stories can transform, and transformation always starts with a choice, your choice.